The air over central Poland in September 1939 carried the scent of dry wheat and gun oil. Summer was ending, but the fields still shimmered with the pale gold of harvest. It was beautiful, heartbreakingly so, and everyone knew beauty was about to vanish under the treads of machines they had never seen before. In those first weeks of war, sound travelled differently, muffled by fear, sharpened by instinct. A dog's bark in the next village made soldiers pause. A passing airplane, invisible behind clouds, silenced entire streets. And somewhere near the edge of the Campinos forest, a handful of men in small steel boxes were preparing to face an empire. Edmund Roman Orlik wiped his goggles with a corner of his scarf. He was 25, pale-skinned from too many nights inside the cramped interior of a Polish TKS tankette. The machine beside him looked more like a toy than a weapon, barely 2 meters long, thin-skinned, low enough to disappear behind a bush. Yet Orlik treated it with reverence, as if it were a knight's armour from an older age. The soldiers called it the sardine can. Orlik called it my chance. Behind him, 2 more TKS vehicles idled, their tiny engines clattering like sewing machines. The smell of gasoline mixed with damp forest soil. A sergeant approached from the shadows, his boots crunching over fallen pine needles. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "reports from the scouts. German armour moving south, maybe a dozen vehicles." Orlik nodded. The sergeant hesitated. "They say there's a Panzer I4 among them." That name carried a weight all its own. Polish crews had learned to fear it. The Panzerkampfwagen IV was the biggest and heaviest tank the Wehrmacht had deployed so far. A metal fortress, 40 tons of thunder, its 75mm gun capable of smashing any Polish armour like an eggshell. And Orlik's tankette, armed with a single 20mm autocannon, was hardly a match. But war rarely waits for perfect balance. The invasion had begun only 2 weeks earlier, and already Poland was fracturing under the pressure. The Germans had crossed from the west and north, the Soviets were massing to the east, and every hour the skies hummed with Luftwaffe planes. Warsaw still stood, defiant, but its supply lines were collapsing. To hold any position now required imagination more than power. For Orlik and his men, imagination meant moving unseen, striking fast, and vanishing before the enemy understood what had hit him. Their TKS units were not built for duels. They were scouts, eyes of the army. But Orlik had something rare, a prototype mount, a 20mm FKA automatic cannon, one of the few in existence. He had begged his commander to let him keep it, and now that gun was his only hope of turning this fragile machine into a predator. He looked around at his small command. 3 vehicles, 6 souls in total. Each man carried the same mixture of pride and disbelief, that they were still fighting, that Poland still breathed. The forest around them seemed alive, whispering through the wind, urging them to stay low. "Engines off," Orlik ordered. "Wait for my signal." The men complied, and the forest fell back into silence. Somewhere in the distance, artillery thundered. It was dull and far away, like a storm rolling across the horizon. The sun dipped lower, turning the trees into silhouettes. They had learned to read light. Dusk was their ally, the hour when shadows stretched long enough to hide a tankette. As they waited, Orlik's thoughts drifted backward, beyond the smoke and gunmetal, to the years before all this madness. He remembered the academy in Modlin, the smell of textbooks and machine oil, the pride of putting on his first officer's uniform. He remembered his father, a veteran of the Polish-Soviet War, telling him that Poland's strength would always be its heart, not its weapons. At the time that had sounded poetic. Now it felt like prophecy, and a cruel one. A bird fluttered out of a nearby branch. Instinctively, Orlik raised his binoculars. A faint glimmer of light flickered on the horizon. Glass reflected metal. Armor. He counted shapes. 8, maybe 9. Then a larger silhouette, squat and menacing, moving slower than the rest. A Panzer IV. He exhaled through his teeth. God help us, he muttered. To his radio operator he said, "Signal the others. Prepare ambush positions. We hit them from the flank. If the big one shows its side, we take it." The tankettes moved silently across the field, their tracks muffled by soft soil. They positioned themselves behind a line of bushes near a bend in the road, perfect ground for surprise. Through the periscope, Orlik could see the German column approaching. The enemy tanks were confident, almost casual, their hatches open, crews talking, some even smoking. They didn't expect resistance here. They thought Poland had already broken. Inside the TKS, the air grew heavy. The engine was silent now. Only the ticking of the clock on Orlik's wrist filled the space. Sweat trickled down his neck. His gunner, Corporal Roman Hermann, checked the feed of the autocannon. 5 rounds per second. It wasn't much, but if he could hit the vulnerable side armor or the engine compartment, it could be enough. Orlik raised his hand. Wait, wait. The first 3 German tanks passed. Light armored vehicles, easy kills, but he held fire. He wanted the Panzer IV, the monster at the center of the line, the one whose destruction would echo far beyond this forest. When the beast finally appeared, Orlik felt his pulse slow. The tank loomed enormous through the periscope lens, broad hull, long cannon, black iron cross glinting on its side. It was almost majestic in its brutality. "Now," Orlik whispered. The first shot cracked like a whip. The autocannon spat flame, and a trail of fire leapt across the short distance. The shell struck the Panzer's side armor with a shriek of sparks. Smoke burst from its vents. A second round followed, then a third, hammering the same spot. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the German tank jolted to a halt. The turret jerked violently. A hatch opened, then closed again in panic. "Hit!" Hermann shouted, reloading. Orlik fired again. A burst of flame erupted from the rear of the Panzer. The sound rolled through the forest like thunder. He could see men jumping off the accompanying vehicles, diving for cover. The smaller Panzers turned their guns toward the source of fire, but by then the Polish tankettes were already shifting positions, disappearing into brush like quicksilver. The forest exploded into chaos. Machine gun fire tore through leaves. Branches snapped. The TKS's thin armor clanged as bullets ricocheted. Inside, Orlik's ears rang. He gritted his teeth, slammed the gear lever, and moved to a new spot, 3 meters to the right. He aimed again at the crippled Panzer, which now smoked heavily, its turret struggling to rotate. Another burst, and the tank erupted in a column of black fire. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then shouts rose in German, orders barked, confusion spreading. The rest of the convoy began to reverse, but the narrow forest road offered little room to maneuver. Orlik's 2 supporting tankettes struck from different angles, pouring autocannon fire into the retreating line. A second enemy vehicle burst into flames. The ambush had lasted less than 2 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. When the last echo faded, all that remained was the hiss of burning metal and the distant hum of engines fleeing north. Orlik's hands trembled as he removed his goggles. He was alive. They were alive. "Lieutenant," Hermann said, voice hoarse, "we got them." Orlik nodded slowly. Outside, smoke curled above the trees, black against the evening sky. He could still feel the recoil of the gun vibrating in his bones. It didn't feel like victory, more like survival borrowed for a few hours. Night settled over the forest. The tankettes regrouped by a small creek, their engines ticking as they cooled. The men spoke in low voices, almost whispers. Someone lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating weary faces. They were too exhausted to celebrate. Orlik sat on the edge of his tankette, staring into the darkness. He thought of the Germans trapped inside their steel monster, of how quickly triumph turns to terror. He had been trained to fight men, not ghosts of machines. But this war, this new war, had changed the rules. It was no longer about courage or honor. It was about who could outthink the other in seconds, who could turn weakness into surprise. He looked down at his small tank, its paint scarred by shrapnel, its tracks clogged with mud. "Little one," he murmured, patting the armor plate, "you did well." It was half joke, half prayer. Above them, distant flares glowed in the night sky, signals from battles raging elsewhere. Poland was burning on every horizon. But for this moment, in this corner of the forest, a handful of men in tin cans had brought down a giant. To the historians who would one day write of that September, it was a minor skirmish. To those who lived it, it was proof that courage could still matter. Orlik would go on to fight again, at Campinos, at Warsaw, but the memory of that first clash would follow him forever. The spark of his 20mm gun, the roar of the Panzer's explosion, the smell of burning pine needles and oil. And somewhere in that silence afterward, in the uneasy peace that followed battle, Edmund Roman Orlik began to understand that wars are not won by machines alone. They are won, for a heartbeat at least, by the will of a man who refuses to yield. The night after the ambush was windless. Smoke hung low between the trees, moving only when someone exhaled. The Polish tankettes stood like sleeping animals beside a narrow forest road, their steel hulls still warm to the touch. Around them lay the remnants of battle, shattered branches, tracks pressed deep into mud, the distant crackle of fires where the German convoy had burned. Lieutenant Edmund Roman Orlik sat on a fallen log, his back to the smouldering wrecks. His uniform smelled of oil and cordite. He had washed his face in the creek, but the water hadn't removed the metallic taste of gunpowder from his mouth. The moon was thin and high, the same silver colour as the hull of his little tankette. Behind him, Corporal Roman Herman was counting ammunition with the mechanical focus of someone who needed to keep his hands moving. 43 rounds left, he muttered, his voice hollow. Maybe less. The barrel's almost cooked. Orlik didn't answer. He was watching the horizon, where the fires of the Panzer still flickered through the trees like distant lanterns. "They'll send others," he said finally. "Bigger ones." "Then we move before dawn?" Orlik nodded. Before dawn. They didn't speak of the Germans who had burned alive inside the tank. No one did. The men had looked once, just once, at the twisted shapes in the wreckage, and then turned away. War demanded attention, not reflection. Reflection could come later, if it ever came at all. When morning arrived, mist rolled in from the meadows, softening the outlines of destruction. It was beautiful in a cruel way, as if nature had decided to paint over what man had done. Birds sang. The air smelled of wet grass and diesel. Orlik ordered his crew to check the tracks, refill the radiators with creek water, and prepare to move. Their orders from command were simple. Harass the enemy, delay his advance, survive if possible. But command had become a ghostly concept. Radio contact was sporadic. Maps no longer matched reality. Roads were blocked by refugees, and bridges were either blown up or already in German hands. The Polish army was fighting a retreat on every front, and small units like Orlik's were left to their own judgment. They drove east, away from the smoke. The TKS machines rattled along narrow dirt paths, their engines coughing like old lungs. Civilians appeared from the forest, families with carts, old men on bicycles, women carrying bundles of clothes. They looked at the tiny armoured vehicles with a mixture of hope and disbelief, as if these metal beetles might somehow stop the German tide. Orlik lifted his hand in brief salute, but he couldn't meet their eyes for long. By noon, they reached a crossroads littered with the carcasses of abandoned trucks. Polish infantrymen were digging shallow trenches nearby, their faces grey with exhaustion. An officer recognized Orlik's insignia and approached. "You're from the reconnaissance battalion?" the man asked. "Was," Orlik replied. "Now we're what's left." The officer nodded grimly. "Same everywhere. We've orders to hold this road until Warsaw can regroup. Think you can cover our flank?" Orlik glanced at the forest beyond the fields. "If we're lucky, we can slow them down, not stop them. That's all anyone asks." So they stayed. The next day passed in tension, waiting for engines that didn't come. Planes droned overhead, distant shadows against the sun. Once, a formation of Stukas appeared, diving on a nearby village. Even from kilometers away, the explosions sounded like a drumbeat under the earth. Hermann cursed softly. "They don't even need tanks," he said. "They have wings." Orlik said nothing. His eyes followed the fading smoke trails in the sky. He felt small, not in fear, but in scale. The world had become too large for men like him. That night, the infantry shared their rations. Stale bread, a tin of sardines, a flask of vodka that went around the circle twice. They joked softly, because laughter was the only thing that made silence bearable. Someone asked about Orlik's tankette, the one with the strange gun. "It's the prototype," Hermann explained proudly. 20mm FKA, built in Warsaw. Only a handful exist. "Does it work?" another soldier asked. Orlik looked at his crewman and smiled faintly. "It did yesterday." The men laughed, but the sound quickly faded. Beyond the campfire, the night pressed close, full of rustling leaves and unseen movement. Somewhere, an owl called. The forest smelled of resin and smoke. Later, when the others slept, Orlik took his notebook from his breast pocket. The pages were damp, the ink smudged, but he wrote anyway. September 19th. Pociecha. Destroyed 2 enemy tanks, possibly 1 Panzer IV. Losses none. Spirits uncertain. He paused, tapping the pencil against his knee. What did uncertain spirits even mean? That they were alive but didn't know why? That victory felt no different from defeat? He closed the notebook and lay back on the cold ground. Above him the stars shone with careless clarity. Morning again. Orders to withdraw toward Modlin Fortress. The roads were clogged with retreating units and civilians. Horses stumbled under overpacked carts. Columns of smoke rose in every direction. It felt as though the entire country was disintegrating in slow motion. The TKS units moved in short bursts, using side roads, avoiding open ground. Twice they encountered Luftwaffe patrols. Once, a Messerschmitt strafed the tree line, bullets punching holes in the soil around them. Orlik's driver swerved into a ditch, and for a moment the tiny tankette was airborne, landing with a jolt that cracked the suspension. They escaped with dents and a prayer. At a farmhouse along the route, an old woman came out holding a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. She offered it wordlessly to Orlik through the vision slit. Her hands were trembling. "For our soldiers," she said. He wanted to refuse, but hunger and exhaustion made him accept. "Dziękuję, mother," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. She nodded and stepped back as the little machine rattled away down the road, leaving her alone amid the ruins of her village. That afternoon they reached a ridge overlooking a broad plain. In the distance, smoke from burning towns blurred the horizon. The radio crackled with fragments of transmission, units calling for help, coordinates lost in static, voices cut off mid-sentence. The entire defense network was coming apart. Hermann leaned forward in his seat. "Do you think Warsaw can hold?" Orlik's reply came after a long pause. "Warsaw will fight, but I don't know if that's the same as holding." He scanned the sky. Dozens of black dots were moving east, bombers heading toward the capital. For a moment, he imagined the city's streets, the Vistula River glittering in sunlight, the cafes where he used to sit as a cadet. Then he looked back at his own reflection in the periscope. Unshaven, eyes ringed with sleeplessness, a man older than his years. That night they bivouacked near a ruined church. The bell tower had been sheared in half by artillery, and the bell itself lay cracked in the grass, a mute echo of something once sacred. Orlik ran his hand over the metal, feeling the cold surface beneath his fingers. He remembered the German tank's nickname among his men, the Goliath. The irony wasn't lost on him. He too had been part of that biblical story now. But the real battle, he suspected, wasn't between giants and shepherds. It was between faith and exhaustion, between the need to fight and the yearning to rest. When dawn came, mist again cloaked the land. The column prepared to move toward Modlin. Before mounting his tankette, Orlik looked once more at the broken bell. For a second, he imagined it whole, ringing over fields that were not yet scarred by tracks. He imagined a world where courage didn't always end in smoke. Then he climbed into the cramped hull, closed the hatch, and gave the order to advance. The engine coughed, caught, and began its steady mechanical rhythm, the heartbeat of a nation still refusing to die. As they rolled forward into the pale light, Orlik knew the war was far from over. The enemy was everywhere now, on the ground, in the air, in the creeping doubt that settled into every soldier's chest. But somewhere inside him burned the memory of that first victory at Pociesza, a flicker of belief that even the smallest machine, in the hands of a determined man, could change the rhythm of history. And though he could not know it then, that flicker would guide him through the chaos to come, the siege, the retreat, the endless nights of steel and fire. The little TKS moved on, its tracks cutting new scars into the soil of a vanishing Poland. The road to Modlin was a ribbon of ash. Charred wagons, broken rifles, the remains of uniforms torn by shrapnel, all were scattered like offerings to some nameless god of war. The closer Edmund Roman Orlik and his crew came to the fortress, the thicker the smoke grew, until the sun itself seemed hesitant to rise. For the men of the Polish defence, Modlin had become a final refuge, a stone heart still beating in a dying body. The fortress stood where the Narew and Vistula rivers met, a maze of brick ramparts and moats that had outlived empires. The walls had seen Napoleon's armies, the Tsars, the birth of the Second Republic, and now they would see its breaking. As the tankettes rolled through the gates, sentries saluted with hollow eyes. Behind them, hundreds of soldiers, infantry, artillerymen, engineers, moved like ghosts, carrying crates, digging trenches, stacking sandbags. Everyone understood what this place meant. It was not a base anymore, but a tomb, waiting for an inscription. Orlik parked his TKS beside a crumbling bastion and climbed out. His legs ached from days of confinement. The air smelled of lime and smoke. An officer from headquarters approached, clipboard in hand. "Lieutenant Orlik?" "Yes." "You're reassigned to perimeter defense, Western Wall sector. Your unit reports to Major Reginis." Orlik nodded. "Orders received." The officer hesitated, studying him. "You were at Pociesza, weren't you?" Orlik met his gaze. "We were." "They're still talking about that. They say you killed a Panzer IV with a tin can." A faint smile touched Orlik's lips. Then they should know what kind of noise a tin can make. The western wall faced the open fields of the Mazovian plain. From its parapets, Orlik could see the dark smudges of German armoured columns massing in the distance. They moved methodically, like a black tide preparing to swallow the land. His tankettes were positioned in shallow pits behind the embankment, partially camouflaged with branches. The crews worked silently, checking belts, cleaning barrels, whispering small prayers to their machines. The radio crackled intermittently with scattered reports, enemy movements, shell impacts, coordinates. At noon, the first shells fell. The sound was like the tearing of the sky itself. The fortress shuddered under the impact. Dust and plaster rained down from the old walls. Somewhere to the east, a fuel dump went up in a roar of flame. The men instinctively ducked, but Orlik stood still, watching. "This is it," Hermann murmured. Orlik nodded. The last stand. For days the bombardment continued. The Germans ringed the fortress, cutting off supply routes, pounding the defences with artillery and dive bombers. Every explosion sent tremors through the tunnels. The garrison learned to live underground, sleeping beside crates of ammunition, their uniforms stiff with sweat and dust. The TKS units, small and agile, became the messengers and lifelines of the fortress. They darted between sectors, carrying ammunition, evacuating wounded, even relaying orders when radio lines went down. Their thin armour offered little protection, but their size made them ghosts among the ruins. Orlik drove through corridors of smoke and rubble, the constant whine of engines in his ears. Once, while crossing an open stretch of road, a German Stuka appeared overhead. The siren screamed, a banshee wail that made the air itself vibrate. The bomb fell close enough to lift the TKS off its tracks. When the dust cleared, Hermann was bleeding from his temple, but alive. "You all right?" Orlik shouted. "I think so. My ears are ringing." "Then you'll fit right in," Orlik said, forcing a grin. Inside the fortress, time lost meaning. Morning and night blurred together under the dim light of oil lamps. Rumours spread like fever. Warsaw was surrounded. France and Britain were still silent. The Soviets had crossed the eastern border. Every whisper tightened the noose around their hope. One evening, Orlik was summoned to a briefing. In a vaulted chamber that smelled of candle wax and gunpowder, the remaining officers gathered around a crude map. Major Reginis stood at its centre, his uniform torn, his eyes ringed with sleeplessness. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice rough, "the fortress has become a symbol. If we hold even one more day, it tells the world that Poland does not surrender easily." A younger lieutenant muttered, "The world isn't listening." Reginis's jaw tightened. "Then we'll shout louder." He pointed to the western sector. "That's where they'll push next. Lieutenant Orlik, your unit's mobility can be decisive. Hit their flanks when they breach. Fall back before they pin you. Understood?" "Yes, sir." "Good. And one more thing. Whatever happens, keep your men alive. They're worth more than this fortress." Orlik saluted. But as he left the chamber, he felt the weight of a question pressing on his chest. How long could any man keep others alive when the whole country was dying? The next morning, the assault began. German armour rolled toward the western wall, their guns flashing through the smoke. The fortress answered with everything it had: anti-tank rifles, mortars, even captured German guns turned back against their owners. The ground shook continuously, a heartbeat of destruction. Orlik's TKS darted out from behind a collapsed wall, spitting fire from its 20mm cannon. He aimed for weak points, tracks, engine vents, exposed turrets. He saw sparks burst from steel, heard the dull thud of impact. Hermann called out targets, reloaded, fired again. They moved like insects under a giant's foot, dodging shells, diving into cover. Around them, Polish infantry fought with rifles and grenades, faces blackened with soot. The air was thick with the metallic tang of fear and adrenaline. At one point, a Panzer III came within 50 meters, its guns swiveling toward them. Orlik shouted, "Hard left!" The driver jerked the controls, and the TKS slid into a crater, just as the German shell tore through the air above them. The explosion deafened them. Dirt poured through the vision slit. When they climbed back up, the Panzer was burning, its turret twisted like a broken jaw. For a brief, insane moment, Orlik laughed. It was not joy, it was disbelief, the laughter of a man who had outrun death by inches. Hermann joined in, a short bark that turned into a cough. Then the radio crackled. Sector Delta breached, all reserves to the inner wall. By nightfall, the fortress was bleeding. Fires raged in the barracks. The air was thick with ash and cries. Orlik's small unit limped back through the shattered gate, one tankette crippled, another out of ammunition. They parked beside a half-collapsed building and climbed out, their faces black with soot. In the dim light, Orlik looked around at his men, 12 of them left from the original 20. Exhausted, hollow-eyed, but still standing. "You did well," he said quietly. One of them, a young private barely 20, asked, "Do you think anyone knows we're still fighting?" Orlik hesitated. Someone does. They have to. He didn't say who he meant. Maybe God, maybe history, maybe the nameless listener every soldier hopes will remember their noise. That night, he wrote again in his notebook, September 25th, Modlin, fortress holding, enemy close, men tired but steady. If this is the end, let it be loud. He closed the book and sat in silence, listening to the distant thunder of artillery echoing through the ruins. The sound had become almost familiar, like waves against a shore that no longer existed. Outside, the stars were hidden by smoke, but Orlik imagined them still there, watching from behind the darkness. The fortress of Modlin might fall, but the memory of its defiance would travel far beyond the Vistula, whispered in the stories of those who refused to be forgotten. And in that moment, dirty, deafened, half-starved, Edmund Roman Orlik understood the truth of his war, that courage was not a roar, but a whisper that kept speaking even when the world went silent. The dawn of September 27th arrived like a ghost, pale, silent, almost merciful. For 3 days and nights the Germans had hammered the Modlin fortress without pause. The once proud bastions were now heaps of smoking rubble. The rivers around it ran black with silt and oil. Every tree, every building, every inch of soil bore scars of fire. Inside the crumbling fort, men moved through the haze like shadows, their faces coated in the same colour as the walls. Grey, as if they were already becoming part of the stone they defended. Lieutenant Edmund Roman Orlik hadn't slept for nearly 40 hours. His hands trembled when he tried to pour coffee from a dented tin mug. The liquid was cold, the taste bitter, but it kept him standing. Beside him, Hermann sat on a box of spent shells, his bandaged head resting against the wall. "They'll come again soon," Hermann murmured, his voice hollow. Orlik nodded. "They always do." He tried to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. There was no energy left for that. Outside, the sound of engines rolled across the plain, low, steady, methodical. Panzer divisions repositioning for the final assault. Orlik's little tankette sat half-hidden under a collapsed archway, its paint blistered from heat, one track patched with a strip of scavenged metal. It looked tired, like an old dog that had survived too many fights but still bared its teeth when danger came close. He patted the hull gently, as if reassuring an old friend. "You've done enough," he whispered, "but we're not done yet." By mid-morning, the attack began. The sky turned black with smoke and Stukas. Their sirens wailed, that chilling, inhuman scream that made the air itself vibrate. Artillery thundered in reply from within the fortress, shaking the ground so violently that dust rained down in steady curtains. The German infantry advanced in waves, their silhouettes flickering through the smoke. Machine gun fire rattled from the parapets. The fortress answered with a roar of defiance, even as its walls crumbled inch by inch. Orlik climbed into his TKS, shouting to his crew over the noise. "Engine on! Wait for my mark!" Hermann loaded the 20mm cannon, his hands steady despite the shaking ground. The driver, a quiet young soldier named Staszek, gripped the controls. His knuckles were white. "Now!" Orlik yelled. The tankette lurched forward, bursting through the dust cloud. Immediately the world became noise and light. Shells burst around them. The air stank of cordite and burning oil. Orlik fired, the cannon kicking hard against the hull. A German armoured car exploded, rolling onto its side in flames. Another burst. 2 infantrymen fell near a trench line. The TKS darted between craters, its small frame almost invisible amid the wreckage. It was madness, but it was also rhythm, the same deadly dance they had learned in the forests of Pociecha. "Hit that half-track," Orlik shouted. "On it!" Hermann fired. Sparks flew. The German vehicle swerved, burning. "Reload." "Empty, sir." "Then we pull back." They reversed behind a shattered wall. The little machine wheezed, the engine coughing black smoke. Hermann looked over at Orlik. "We're out. That's it." Orlik's jaw tightened. "Then we fight like infantry." He opened the hatch, climbed out, and pulled his sidearm from the holster. The world outside was chaos. Men shouting, buildings collapsing, the smell of blood and wet earth. A Polish anti-tank gun fired from the courtyard, the recoil slamming its crew backward. The shell struck a Panzer on the bridge, setting it ablaze. The men cheered, even as debris rained down around them. For every cheer, there were 3 cries of pain. Orlik and his crew joined a group of riflemen behind a barricade of rubble. Together, they fired down the street toward advancing German troops. Bullets ricocheted off stone. The sound was like angry bees trapped in a box. A grenade went off nearby. The blast knocked Orlik flat, his ears ringing, vision blurred. He sat up to see Hermann dragging him by the collar. "Lieutenant, you all right?" "I'm fine," Orlik coughed, tasting dust. "Still here." "Barely," Hermann muttered. Hours passed like minutes. The fortress was a living organism now, bleeding, burning, groaning with every impact. And yet, it held. Somehow, it still held. As night fell, a strange calm settled over the battlefield. The bombardment ceased. The Germans halted their advance. For the first time in days, there was silence, heavy, unnatural, as if the world had stopped to catch its breath. Orlik sat in the ruins of the barracks, his back against a cracked wall. Around him, men whispered prayers, cleaned rifles, or simply stared into nothing. Someone played a harmonica, a broken tune that wavered in the smoke. The melody was old, familiar, the kind soldiers carried from one war to the next. Hermann handed him a cigarette. "We've done everything we can," he said. Orlik nodded slowly. "Not everything. Not yet." He looked toward the western gate, where flames licked the sky. "We can still buy time." "For what?" "For memory," Orlik said quietly. "For someone to remember that we didn't just vanish." Later that night, Major Raginis gathered the remaining officers in the central courtyard. His voice was hoarse, barely audible over the crackle of fire. "Gentlemen," he began, "we fought with honor. The fortress has done its duty, but our ammunition is gone. The wounded are dying without medicine. The enemy controls the bridges. Continuing will only waste lives." No one spoke. The words hung in the smoke like an execution order. Raginis's eyes moved from face to face. "We will negotiate surrender tomorrow at dawn. You are to destroy any remaining weapons and prepare your men. No one is to resist further. That is an order." A murmur rippled through the group. Orlik felt something tighten in his chest. Surrender. The word burned worse than the smoke. After the meeting, he stood outside under the ruined archway, staring up at the black sky. The moon was hidden behind clouds. Hermann approached, hesitant. "They say it's over," he said. Orlik shook his head. No, it's never over. It just changes shape. Before dawn, he returned to his TKS one last time. The machine sat motionless, silent, like a monument to something that used to matter. He climbed inside, ran his fingers over the controls. The smell of oil and steel filled the cramped cabin. He closed his eyes and listened, not to engines, not to war, but to the faint hum of wind through shattered walls. For a moment, he remembered peace. The academy courtyard in Warsaw, the sound of marching boots on cobblestones, the smell of bread from a morning bakery. He remembered laughter, his own, before the world had turned to smoke. Then he opened his eyes and whispered, "Thank you," to the little machine that had carried him through hell. He stepped out just as the first light of morning touched the fortress. Across the field, German soldiers were already approaching with white flags of truce. The battle was done. Orlik stood at attention as the Polish flag was lowered from the fortress mast. The red and white cloth, torn and blackened, fluttered weakly before collapsing into the arms of a young soldier. No one spoke. Some wept silently, others just watched, faces unreadable. When it was over, Orlik turned away. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's go." Hermann hesitated. "Where?" "East," Orlik answered. "There's always an east." That day, September 29th, 1939, the Modlin fortress fell. But its defenders, men like Edmund Roman Orlik, carried its echo with them. They would scatter across forests and fields, joining what was left of the resistance. Their names would fade from official reports, replaced by the slow march of occupation and silence. Yet somewhere in that silence, the memory of their courage would survive. In whispers, in legends, in the metallic echo of a small tankette's gunfire. History would call it surrender. But for those who lived it, it was something else entirely. A pause between battles, a breath before the long, dark night of Poland began. Autumn arrived early that year. The leaves fell quietly, as if afraid to draw attention. By October, the roads that had once carried armies were filled instead with silence and ghosts. Burnt-out trucks, broken rifles, helmets half buried in mud. The war, at least in its first chapter, was over. Poland was no longer a country. For Lieutenant Edmund Roman Orlik, freedom now came in whispers and shadows. He and Hermann had slipped away from Modlin the night before the surrender, taking the back roads east. Their uniforms were filthy, insignia stripped off. They carried only a few cartridges, a pistol, and what little food they could scavenge from abandoned farmhouses. They avoided main roads, sleeping in barns and ditches, moving only at night. Everywhere they went, the same sight greeted them. Villages half empty, flags torn down, church bells melted for scrap. The occupiers had moved fast, efficient as a storm. German patrols swept through towns, Soviet ones through the east. The two halves of Poland met like jaws closing around a broken bone. By the second week, Orlik's boots were falling apart. Hermann's head wound had reopened. They had crossed the Bug River under cover of mist when they finally met a group of armed civilians. Men and women with armbands sewn from white cloth and eyes too sharp for their age. "Polish army?" one of them asked. "Used to be," Orlik said. "Then you're one of us now." And just like that, he became a soldier again, in an army without uniforms, without insignia, without maps. An army of memory. The unit was small, barely 30 people, hiding among the ruins of the Campinos forest. They called themselves Wilkie, the Wolves. Their leader, an old cavalry officer named Major Wirwa, still wore his sabre at his belt, though there were no horses left to ride. "Warsaw has fallen," Wirwa said during their first meeting, his voice rough but steady. "The government's gone, but the fight isn't over. We'll strike from the shadows now. Trains, convoys, outposts. Every shot we fire reminds them that Poland still breathes. Orlik listened, feeling the familiar spark stir inside him, the same one that had burned at Pociesza, that had carried him through Modlin's inferno. He nodded. I can drive, I can shoot. Tell me where to start. The Major smiled faintly. Good, you'll fit right in. By November, snow had begun to fall, soft, unhurried, like ash. The wolves built a hidden camp deep in the forest, where smoke from their fires blended with morning mist. They scavenged weapons from old battlefields, mended uniforms with thread pulled from curtains, and wrote orders on scraps of newspaper. Orlik's role was simple: sabotage. His knowledge of armoured engines made him invaluable. He taught the others how to disable German trucks with sugar, how to jam tank tracks with frozen mud, how to listen for the faint whistle of engines before a patrol appeared. One night, under the flickering light of a campfire, Hermann asked him, "Do you ever think about Modlin?" Orlik didn't answer at first, the flames reflected in his eyes. "Every day," he said finally, "but it feels like a dream now, a loud one." "You think it meant anything?" Orlik looked up at the stars, pale, distant, the same ones he had seen through the fortress smoke. "Everything means something," he said, "even if only to us." Their first mission came in December. A German supply train carrying fuel and ammunition to the front was scheduled to pass near Sochachow. The wolves planned to derail it using a charge set beneath a wooden bridge. Orlik led the team, 4 men, 2 women, 1 mule carrying explosives wrapped in blankets. The air was sharp, the snow crunching underfoot. Every sound felt too loud. They worked quickly, planting the charge as Hermann watched the tree line. When the train came, it was already too late for the enemy to stop it. The explosion tore through the night, a single, thunderous heartbeat. Fire blossomed against the sky, lighting the snow in shades of orange and red. The wolves melted back into the forest before the echo faded. That night, the partisans whispered stories around their campfire. "It's like David and Goliath," one of them said. Orlik smiled faintly. "Then let's keep throwing stones." Winter deepened. Food grew scarce, tempers shorter. Patrols increased. German units began burning villages suspected of harbouring resistance. Once, after an operation, Orlik's team returned to find an entire hamlet reduced to ash. Barns smouldering, snow stained black. He walked among the ruins in silence. A child's toy, a wooden horse, lay half buried near a well. Hermann knelt beside him. "We can't save them all," he said quietly. "I know," Orlik replied, "but I can't get used to it." That night he sat alone by the dying fire and wrote in his notebook, the same one he had carried since September. The pages were nearly full now. December 18th. Sochachow Bridge destroyed. Casualties heavy. Snow hides everything, even blood. Sometimes I wonder if courage and despair are the same thing, just seen from different sides. He closed the book and looked into the dark. Somewhere beyond the trees, wolves howled, real ones this time. For a moment, he envied them their simplicity. They hunted, they survived. They didn't need to remember. In January, a coded message arrived from Warsaw. A courier, half frozen, brought word that the underground resistance, the beginnings of what would become the Armia Krajowa, the Home Army, was organizing networks across occupied Poland. The wolves were to merge into this growing structure. Major Wirwa gathered them in the snow. "This isn't about battles anymore," he said. "It's about survival, of people, of memory, of truth. You'll be given false names, new identities. If they catch you, there will be no uniforms to protect you. But remember this: Poland lives wherever her sons still refuse to kneel." The men and women nodded. Some crossed themselves. Others simply stared into the flames. silent. When it was over, Wehrwe turned to Orlik. "You're to go to Warsaw. The capital needs men who've fought tanks before. They're planning something big." Orlik frowned. "What kind of something?" The major's eyes glinted. "They call it hope." A week later, Orlik and Hermann left the forest, following the frozen Vistula toward the occupied city. Along the way, they passed columns of prisoners, soldiers, refugees trudging through snow toward camps in the west. The world had become a single, endless march. At night, they hid in barns or the ruins of burned churches. Orlik often dreamt of engines, the roar of tanks, the crack of gunfire, only to wake to silence. The war had gone underground, but its sound still lived inside him. On the seventh night, they reached the outskirts of Warsaw. The city was a scar, buildings shattered, statues toppled, streets patrolled by grey-coated soldiers. Yet beneath the rubble, life pulsed quietly. Candles glowed behind curtained windows. Messages were passed in loaves of bread. In the heart of the ruins, Orlik found the next chapter of his war waiting for him. Not in open battlefields, but in basements and back rooms where whispers were deadlier than bullets. Warsaw, 1940. Winter pressed against the city like a weight. Snow clung to the rubble where buildings once stood, softening the edges of destruction. The streets smelled of coal smoke and fear. German banners hung from what remained of the government quarter, red cloth fluttering against a grey sky. For Edmund Roman Orlik, the war had changed its uniform. No more tanks, no formations, no bugles. The fight now lived in whispers, encoded messages, forged papers, false names. He was Jan Nowak now, a mechanic by trade, working in a garage requisitioned by the Wehrmacht. His hands were always black with grease, his speech careful, clipped, obedient. But beneath the noise of hammers and engines, the resistance hummed, quiet as a fuse waiting to catch. Every evening after curfew, he met others like him in the cellars beneath Świętokrzyska Street. There were teachers, doctors, students, even a few former officers. They shared no uniforms, only a single rule: work in silence, strike without warning. They printed leaflets on smuggled presses, mapped troop movements, sabotaged convoys. But their deadliest weapon was information, gathered by eyes that pretended not to see. Orlik trained new recruits, teaching them how to disable engines with a handful of sand, how to time explosives to railway crossings, how to disappear when questioned. He spoke softly, patiently, as if every word might be overheard by the walls. The trick, he told them, is not to win, it's to keep the enemy from sleeping. Months turned into years. The city changed faces but never healed. Every wall bore bullet holes. Every corner held memories. In 1941, word spread of uprisings in the countryside, of executions in reprisal. For every act of defiance, 100 civilians were shot. Yet still the underground grew. The Home Army had become a nation beneath the nation, a pulse beating beneath the occupier's boot. One night, in a basement dimly lit by a single candle, a courier handed Orlik an envelope marked only with the letter W. Inside was a map and a note. German experimental convoy passing near Młochiny, transporting heavy armor components. Priority: destroy. Possible connection to new tank prototype. Orlik stared at the map for a long moment. Tanks again. After all these years, the circle had closed. He looked at Hermann, now thinner, older, his face lined from hunger and sleeplessness. One more ride. Hermann grinned weakly. You think I'd miss it? The operation took place under a half-moon sky. A narrow country road wound between the forests north of Warsaw. The convoy was expected before dawn. 3 trucks and 1 armoured escort. The partisans worked in silence, setting explosives beneath the bridge timbers. Orlik crouched beside the detonator, his breath visible in the cold air. The sound of engines came first, a low, distant murmur. He raised his hand. The others tensed. The trucks appeared, headlights cutting through mist. When the armoured car reached the centre of the bridge, Orlik pressed the plunger. The explosion shattered the night. Wood splintered, metal screamed. The convoy vanished in a storm of fire and falling debris. Flames leapt high, reflected in the river below. For a brief, breathless moment, it felt like 1939 again. The same thunder, the same taste of cordite and victory. Then came the return fire. Machine guns tore through the darkness. Orlik shouted for retreat. They scattered into the forest, pursued by the blaze of tracer rounds. Hermann stumbled, clutching his side. "Go," he gasped. "No," Orlik said, pulling him up. "We go together." They ran until the shots faded, until only the crackle of burning wood followed them. In the silence that came after, the two men collapsed in the snow, gasping for air. Hermann's wound was bad. Blood seeped through his coat. He smiled faintly. "Guess this is where the road ends." "Don't say that. Come on, Edmund. We both knew it wouldn't last forever." Orlik pressed his hand over the wound, feeling the heat against his palm. "We'll get you to the city." But Hermann was already shaking his head. "Promise me something." "Anything. When this is over, when they're gone, tell them we weren't ghosts, that we fought." Orlik swallowed hard. "I promise." Hermann's hand tightened once, then went still. The forest around them was silent again. Snow fell softly, covering the blood, as if trying to make the world forget. Days later, Orlik returned to Warsaw alone. The mission had been a success, the convoy destroyed, the Germans shaken. But the cost was written in red on the snow. He reported to his contact, gave the details, then walked out into the frozen morning. The city was waking, trams rattling, people queuing for bread, soldiers marching past posters that declared, "Der Sieg ist nah." The victory is near. Orlik watched them pass, his face expressionless. Then he turned down a side street, into the narrow alleys that the occupiers rarely patrolled. He reached a small chapel, half hidden between ruins. Inside, candles burned beneath the cracked icon of the Virgin. He lit one more and placed it beside the rest. The flame trembled, its light faint but steady. He whispered Hermann's name. Then the names of others, men from Modlin, from Pociecha, from a Poland that now lived only in memory. Outside, the wind howled through the broken windows like distant engines. The years that followed blurred together, 1942, 1943. The underground grew, splintered, grew again. Orlik continued to fight, sometimes with weapons, more often with silence. When the uprising came in 1944, he was there, older, slower, but still carrying the notebook he had begun 5 years earlier. Its pages were filled with cramped handwriting, the ink faded but legible. The last entry read, "Warsaw still stands. Even if no stone remains upon another, she stands. And so do we." He disappeared during the fighting that August. Some said he was killed near the riverbank. Others claimed he escaped across the Vistula and joined partisans in the east. No one ever found his body. But years later, when the war finally ended, a scavenger searching through the ruins of Śródmieście found a small rusted metal box buried under a collapsed wall. Inside was a water-damaged notebook. The first line read, "Pociecha, 1939. We were small, but we fought like giants." Today, historians remember Edmund Roman Orlik as one of the first tank aces of the Second World War, a man who destroyed Germany's mightiest machines with a weapon no bigger than a car. But those who tell his story rarely mention what came after, the years in shadow, the quiet war fought in silence and sacrifice. His legend lives not only in battles, but in the belief that even when nations fall, courage does not. And perhaps, somewhere deep in the forests of Poland, where the snow still covers forgotten tracks and rusted steel, the echo of that small 20mm cannon still lingers. A heartbeat from a time when faith was made of fire.